world. She's lived in the UK, France, and Greece, but she is ultimately a Queensland girl. So we were so happy that she returned in about 2010. Susan's been married twice and will be very surprised if she goes for the trifecta.
Absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out.
And a special welcome back from Kithera, because that's where Susan's been for the last few years. So please welcome back Susan Johnson. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you so much. And can I just say, Yasu Chikanis? I think we have a lot of Kitherians in there. Hello, thank you so much for joining. And, you know, if you know more, I miss you all. It's wonderful to see some faces that I can just make out there from Kithera. So wonderful. And we have also some other Greek Australian Kitherians in the audience. One of whom, I have to say, I've pinched her name, Chrysanthi. Thank you. We have the original Chrysanthi here tonight. But it is, you know, deeply moving to be here on many levels, because I've been one of the stranded Australians. It's taken me best part of 6 months to get back, 3 different tickets. I eventually had to raid my super to get a business class ticket. And, you know, I've spent most of my life as a fiction writer, so I'm not a rich person. But I have to count myself as one of the lucky ones. But what is Australia doing, people? The only country in the world besides New Zealand, which is not allowing its own citizens to return. And I have some other dear friends up the back whose son is best friends with my son. He was due to come back in July last year. He had no house, he had no job, a young person like my son is. They were in London and they're still in London, and now he's had to just completely change his whole life. So can I just put in a plea? I'm very aware that Australia has got a very bad record with the people who do try and come to this place, Manus Island. We've got people who are banged up in much worse conditions than 5-star hotels just over the bridge in Kangaroo Point. So I'm very aware that as a sort of privileged white Australian, my case may seem a bit, well, too bad for you, but we need to think of this as a humanitarian crisis for those people who are worse off than me and get them home. Yes. So whatever you can do, bring it back. And in some ways that touches on your wonderful novel, From Where I Fell, because it is about communication. It is about people who meet across the seas. So it starts with an anguished email from Pamela Robson in Australia to her ex-husband in Paris, which accidentally ends up in the inbox of a New York State teacher, Chrysanthi Woods. From here, an unlikely friendship begins. This is the heart of a wonderfully rich, thought-provoking, and very, very modern novel. So and it's told in emails. And I think everybody in this room has accidentally sent an email to someone or received an email meant for somebody else. And there are a huge number of Fionas in the book trade and in publishing. You wouldn't believe the number of emails that I have accidentally received with highly confidential information. So what was the initial idea for this?
So the jumping off point actually was exactly as you say, an email sent to the wrong person. So I have a friend who's a publisher in St. Paul, Minnesota, and we're longtime friends. And I sent her an email, but she changed her address she changed her server. So I just assumed she'd have the same format for the front part and just change the server. Well, it ended up going to someone completely random who was in another part of America entirely, in San Jose, in California. And but here's where the fluke came in. He was a would-be writer. So he was really interested in what I was writing about to my friend, because we were talking about writerly things. And I don't think if there hadn't been that sort of fluke of circumstances that we had something in common, I don't think we would have kept writing. But in fact, I'm still in touch with him probably about 10 years later. So that was the kind of jumping off point, the original mistake. However, then I started to think, well, could you actually get away with writing a whole book like this? And then I thought about epistolary novels, because I love novels of letters. That's a very, I'm sure many of you remember some yourselves, but some of my favourites would be 84 Charing Cross Road, a recent one. But even, you know, I've forgotten that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was all told in letters. I mean, it's actually, there's very, very many. And of course, Samuel Richardson, who did the original epistolary novel, Pamela, and I pinched her name for one of the other characters. And so I've always been interested in that form, but it's a very literary form. So we all know that emails are colloquial, they're, you know, quotidian, they're dashed off, it's got demotic language. So how are you going to turn the language of email into something resembling literature? So before long, I realised I had absolutely built myself a complete house of horror, because there is no way. I thought it's going to look like a gimmick, you know, some sort of gimmick. So how am I going to do this? And so I had a whole lot of technical levels at craft, and I'm happy to speak to the writers in the room about that, but it was quite difficult to do. So I would have to say, this, of all the novels I've written, this has been the one that's reworked most, and it's gone through so many iterations, many iterations, and many drafts. And so it's always a surprise to me that people say, oh, it just reads like a, you know, like they're dashed off emails and say, excellent.
Did you consider another form? So you had the idea. Did you consider another form?
Yes, I definitely did consider another form, because firstly, my agent and my publisher said, oh my God, is this, you really going to do the whole thing in emails? Like, isn't it going to be just an introductory thing? And Matt Condon, he can't be here tonight, but he was one of the other readers. He said, well, I like it as an idea, but I think I would rather, you know, see it move into narrative. And so I did play around in one of the iterations of this book, certainly into moving it, segueing it into a more expected narrative form. But in fact, I realised that then I was sort of doing something different. Then I really started to look at the culture of emails and the sort of whole, like, there's hardly anything written in academic terms about emails, I have to say. There's very few. When I started to research this, there's one woman at Swinburne in Melbourne called Esther Mill. She's an associate professor in media studies, I think. And she was the only one that was writing about this and looking at examining the kind of new public space in some ways of email, that it may very well be a new kind of forum for intimacies where they can't be otherwise examined, you know. And one of the things that she found out in her original research, and this was in 2010, so I'm going back a long time, she's got a new novel out too, a new book out too, which is I recommend as well. But the 2010 one found that, in fact, the fact that you don't know this person, you never met them, can sometimes lead to this very strange sort of intense, almost felt spiritual relationship, which can often be deeper than met relationships, because you know there's a disembodied self. So might that disembodied self be a kind of vehicle for just a consciousness? Like maybe you can just get a human consciousness out in some way. So I was playing around with that. So then I became really wedded to the idea of emails. And let me tell you, people didn't like this book. There were some, you know, it went out. There were some people who didn't like it at all. You know, so not everybody's a fan.
No. I am, and it's because I think, yes, it's a novel of ideas, but what you've done with these two characters, Chrysanthi and Pamela, is you've given them a real insight into their characters. So we really know what Pamela is like, and we really know what Chrysanthi is like. So how did you manage to do that?
Well, getting back to my original relationship with my friend in San Jose, and when we first met, I said to him, all I know about is San Jose is that Dionne Warwick song, you know, Burt Bacharach. I know nothing about, you know, San Jose. So you start off from this point. I'm a very character-based writer anyway. That's why I always start from character. And I realized that these two women had to have some reason to connect. They absolutely had to, you know, you can't send off an email to anybody and you've got some sort of connection. What is the connection? So the connection was Pamela is at a moment of crisis in her life, and she's a blurter, and the other character, Chris, is much more restrained and much more, but also she's a person who functions as a sort of, she's very interested in other people's lives. You know, she's quite, she's the one who's interested. You know, she wants to know, why is the husband in Paris? Has she heard back from him pretty quickly? You know, in some ways you could say she's a bit of a busybody, but in other words, you know, I mean, that would be the, you know, ungenerous way of looking at it. So they connect from that level. And then once I started to get the development of the characters, I thought, I also thought about the idea of, I've got two voices, two dialogues, almost like a two voice dialogue. And so in a way, then I started to really look at Socratic dialogues and how could you actually inject ideas about being and, you know, how to live within that domestic novel. So really, it's a novel of ideas sort of smuggled in through a Trojan horse, like you know, that's the vehicle, but it looks like it's a domestic novel, but many women's novels also described as domestic novels, and we have had many conversations about that. But it actually is a novel of ideas, I hope.
Absolutely. So as you were writing, what were some of the ideas that you wanted to investigate?
Okay, so they look at, one of the central ideas is marriage. One of them is in a marriage breakup. The other is in a long-term marriage. So it's looking at what keeps couples together. What actually is it? And Pamela is the daughter of a classic 1950s mother who didn't work, who had quite a tumultuous relationship with her husband. But as in many relationships in the 50s, there was the home and then there was outside, and you kept whatever was in the home deeply within the home, and you didn't ever talk about the failings of your husband, especially. And this generation, the next generation, women who don't necessarily have long, lifelong relationships with marriages have got a completely different relationship. So I'm looking at both those, Pamela in her relationship and Chris in hers. So marriage was one. Female guilt, huge part of this book. It's really an examination of female guilt. I realised afterwards that she's left her marriage. She feels guilty that she's wrecked her children's lives. She feels guilty that she's left the marriage. She feels guilty. Chris feels guilty about her mother. Chris is looking after her elderly mother in Schenectady in New York. And guilt of women, it's something that I think women deal with on a much more visceral level than men in general. And I was really interested in taking apart that. But basically it's about, you know, as any novel, I'm sure every novel, essentially, if you want to strip it down to what a novel is a way of presenting what it feels like to be alive and human consciousness, obviously. But within that, sort of, it's really examining ways of being. Like I did this wonderful interview this morning with Radio National for the book show about a beautiful book. I don't know whether you've read it. It's Frances Burford's new book, Light Perpetual.
I love Frances Burford.
Yeah, I do too. And anybody who hasn't read The Child That Books Built, it's his memoir of reading. And he's an English writer who is a really, really wonderful writer. I haven't read On Golden Hill. I know everybody else has, but has anyone read it, On Golden Hill? Yeah, yeah. So Cassie and Kate also loved it, and they had high expectations for this one. But basically, he's talking about what reading does and what novels do is to try and enlarge the perception of, to try and recreate the kind of 380, the physical world that we live in, and somehow bring that to life on the page. And he does that absolutely magnificently, and all the great 19th century novels do and whatever. And there's some wonderful novels around today and novelists. I'm a huge fan of Rachel Cusk. I think she's doing really interesting things with fiction, and Ingrid Nunes as well. So that's kind of the territory.
Yes. And because you also write that writing can be a means of facing down fears. So what does that mean to you as a writer and also a reader?
Okay, well, as it's one of the things that's been put to me pretty much from my first novel in 1987 is people just think I've ripped up the pages of my diary and plonked it straight down and sent it straight off to the publisher. And, it used to really rile me. I used to get so upset because it's kind of offensive. It's sort of, it's like that they think that you just, there's no work involved for a start, that you just, put your, but what I try and do is write out of my fears and terrors and the worst, I try to get an emotional honesty and emotional authenticity. That means you do have to put yourself on the page in some way. And I don't mean literally. I don't mean that everything happens in that book happened to me, but the emotional truth did. I was on the floor. Sorry, I was about to swear to the Kithian, sorry. I was on the floor after my own divorce, and I know it's a commonplace that divorce is just one of those things that you, 1 in 3 marriages ends in divorce. It's all, let's have a divorce party or whatever. In my experience, everybody I know who's been through a divorce it's felt like being stabbed in the heart. It's actually very, very painful. So I did read quite a lot around divorce. I read a lot of, you've only got to look at the family court to see the level of emotion divorce arouses. The black count in the family court is so depressing. And, you don't have to get murdered. You don't have to set your wife alight. That's the extremes. But there's so many other gradations of divorce. So that's what I mean. When I think you've got to write completely authentically, that's what I try and do. Which means, sometimes it feels very flaying. And now, when people think it is my life, look, yes, there's no doubt that has been inspired by events in my life and my lived experience of divorce and with my difficulties with my children in the wake of divorce. However, I can, it is a created thing. It is an absolutely worked thing. And now, if anybody says to me, they quite a few, someone actually asked me in an interview, how come you gave her 3 children? Like, you've got 2 children. Why has she got 3 children? Like, there's a real, mistake of identity. But now, in fact, rather than protest too much, the more you protest, the more people think, oh. So I'm actually quite pleased now that people think it's the literal truth. Now, I think it's a kind of convoluted, backhanded compliment. If people think everything in that book is true.
Yeah, because it does mean it's worked for the reader, and that the reader has immersed themselves and they feel like they're reading someone's lived experiences. So, and your book is, as you've described it, a Trojan horse of ideas, and one of them kind of comes back to how we started this conversation, is that we have Pamela, the divorced mother of 3. She's lived around the world and she's returned to Sydney, and we've got Chris, the New York State teacher. Where's she from? Schenectady? I couldn't say it, but we have a very dear friend from Schenectady in New York who's a Catherian, and she taught me to say it when I was 19. So that's why I can say it so easily, but it's really hard to say. Schenectady. It used to be where General Electric was based, and it's actually a really wonderful part of New York. And so Chris has barely left this state. So we've got Pamela, she's moved around the world, and we've got Chris, who hasn't really left the state. And so I'm curious about those ideas about belonging and the contrast with this, the unplacedness of digital space, which is a quote from you. So what were you looking at investigating there with that notion of belonging, movement, and the digital space as well?
That was definitely something I wanted to, when you asked me about the other ideas, that was definitely another thing I was looking at, home versus elsewhere, because as someone who's lived out of Australia a long time, for me, it's a very vexed and painful question in many ways. I remember years ago when I was living in London, meeting the late literary editor Ed Victor, and he said to me, he had Barry Humphries and Germaine Greer and a whole lot of people on his list, big name Australians, and he said to me, I don't know what it is about you Australians. I have never met another race of people who are so tortured about their country, except for Russians. Like he just said, and it's true. I think every Australian I know, I think it's something to do with the distance. It's so far from everywhere. If you just tow it a bit closer, I feel so jealous of my friends in England who can just move to France or Greece, or, it's like moving to Adelaide. Really, it is actually a big problem. And I think the tyranny of distance for Australians is still there, despite the fact, it's not until you've got your father on the operating table and you're flying out to see your mum, and you don't know until you've stepped off the plane if your dad's alive or not. And it wasn't until I saw mum and she was, in the arrivals hall, and she, I didn't know if my father, and, that's, I know it's supposed to be 24 hours, and we're talking here pre-COVID, obviously, but it's still a big notion. So I think for all Australians, it's a live issue. And I'm aware that not everybody, not even Australians or Greeks or whatever, most people want to stay in their place where they're born. Most people do, and they're very happy to stay in the place where they're born, including Greeks, including French people, including Australians. So I was really interested in looking at what would compel someone like myself to move, and what would compel someone to stay. And then I also introduced these other two characters who are Syrians, who don't have any option. So don't forget, there are many, many people in the world who don't have any option about being forced out of their homes. So I really wanted to show all kinds of displacement, including forced displacement. So Chris mentors these two Syrian girls who were forced out of their home because they're refugees. And she gives free English classes to them. So I did really want to examine that whole notion of place and elsewhere. And then, so it meant that the whole thing of emails became a way, almost an open free space to examine those sort of questions, because that's the ultimate displacement in some way. So, we have these two people who've never met. They, because Pamela is a blurter, she's immediately sent off a photo of herself. Hello, really wants to go on Facebook and Zoom and whatever. And Chris is just not going to, she's not on Facebook, she's not on social media. She's just not one of those people. And there are people like that. So she doesn't even send a photograph of herself. So these people are very much imagined characters to each other, but they become very quickly this embodied notion of the imagined person that Esther Milne talks about, that in some ways you can have, I forget the expression she uses, it's not spiritual, but she says almost like a telepathic is the word she uses, a telepathic sense of the other person's reality, which becomes even realer than the people that you're seeing. So that gave me a lot of space to explore those things. Yeah.
Because there's the immediacy, and there's also the privacy in so many ways between how they're communicating between each other. And it's almost like that, you meet someone at an airport or on a train or a plane, and something invites you to confide with them. And that's what I felt. There was this immediacy and an intimacy between their relationship.
And maybe, at some point they discuss their real life friends, their flesh and blood friends, as opposed to their, imaginary friendship. And they do talk about, the other thing I want to talk about was women's friendships, because I think they can be very long, complicated and involved. And for a woman like Pamela, her friends actually longer in her life than her husband's. And that's certainly, hello Emma down there, my friends since we were 13. There are many people in my life like that. And so I was really interested in examining that notion of women's friendships. And I think women can have exceptionally close friendships that men don't always have in the same ways. They can, but they're possibly not as intimate. and I was interested in exploring that, that very notion.
Well, speaking of friendships, you've also dedicated the book to Gillian Mears, who's, I'm sure in the audience, many of us have loved Gillian's book. So what's your connection with Gillian?
So Gillian and I Gillian was younger than me, but we started publishing at the same time. We both started publishing really in the late 80s and 90s. And Gillian was such a fine writer. I'm not sure if anybody has read her, but please go out and read her if you haven't. She's a very, very beautiful writer. And we became, we knew each other from around the traps, because Australia's literary scene is quite small and everyone ends up meeting everybody else. But we became really good friends when we were in Paris. I had the Cité Internationale des Arts studio, which is the Nancy Keesing studio. And I think she had it, but she'd stayed on in Paris because she was having this love affair with this French woman. And we were having this, we were going out one night. We'd been out for dinner, and I was going back to the Cité, which was this very sort of, I was writing my book, I was doing all my, being very, I've got this, I'm a first daughter, I have two brothers, I think I have to fulfill if I have an obligation, I'll do what I've got this money to go to Paris to write, so I'll write. Anyway, there was Gillian. Gillian, I don't know if you ever saw her, she was very graceful, she was long and lean, and she had this absolutely wonderful grace about her. Well, we went off on the metro together after this party, and I said, "Oh, I'm going to go home. What are you doing, Gillian?" She said, "I'm going to an orgy. Do you want to come?" No, thank you. She was so at ease in her body and herself. She was the most wonderful person. She was just glorious, absolutely glorious. And I wish I had more courage, but I didn't go. But that's the kind of girl she was. That was the kind of woman she was. So then she was about maybe, I think we must have been in our early 30s. She was younger than me, so she must have been in her late 20s. Then my next experience of Gillian was after I published a memoir after I had my two babies. It must have been about 2000, after the two boys were born. And I had birth trauma that absolutely no one in first world country gets. It's a very rare one. It's a fistula. There's a fistula clinic in Africa that run by Catherine Hamel, who's just died, unfortunately. But it's a very common birth defect, trauma in Africa, because they don't have sterile birth condition. But it's a very rare one, very rare in Australia. And I ended up with a temporary colostomy for 18 months, which was thankfully reversed. But it was, so I wrote this book about not just the trauma, about being a new mother, the birth trauma, but also being a writer and trying to cling on to writing during all this. And to my astonishment, after the book was published about a year later, sometime after the book was published, I got this absolutely wonderful letter from Gillian. And anyone who's had a letter from Gillian, you just treasure it. She wrote to me from the back of the Ant and Bee, who was the ambulance that she was living out of then. And she said, "I completely understand what you're going through. Something's happening to my body." And we had this exchange about what was happening to her body, which no one could find out what it was. And so we got back into contact, and we had a long series of letters, and we saw each other, I think, once more in Sydney. And then by then she realised that it was multiple sclerosis, but a very, very aggressive form of multiple sclerosis, extremely aggressive. And when the lovely Matt Condon gave me my job here when I came back from London in 2010, I pleaded with him, could I go down to Adelaide, because her wonderful book, Fold's Bread, came out, and it won the the Prime Minister's Award. And so I pleaded with Matty if I could go down, and he let me go down. And so we had this wonderful day in Adelaide, where she's very free, but because we were friends, it was just a very free and open sort of day. And she's incredibly open. She said, she's just a wonderful, wonderful person. But she was in incredible pain. By then, her, she had a nurse, and she had to be lifted from the bed, and she was in a wheelchair. And that this incredibly striding forth free person could be, so hobbled. And so then she really realised that her days were limited. So typical Gillian, she said, "Don't come to my funeral, come to my party." And so about a year before she died, she invited everybody down to the country town where she was living with her sisters. You'll know her sisters from the Grant sisters, and had this wonderful party where she was dancing in her wheelchair.
Well, I know she would love this book, and I think she would want you to go out and have an orgy to celebrate.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah.
You did, just finally before I might get you to read. Are you happy to read?
Yeah, I haven't chosen anything. Should I choose the beginning? I
Yes,
suppose.
I think so, yes. So while you're thinking about that, I'll also ask you one final question, and that is about your writing practice. You mentioned that you were like a goody two-shoes, making sure you were doing your homework in Paris. What's your writing practice like? Like, what kind of writer are you?
Well, you were asking me before about the writing of your fears and terrors. I mean, I think I'm definitely a writer who I believe I'm a very instinctive writer for a start, and I think I try and write in the mornings, because I think the closer you are to dreams and that lack of inner critic, because I'm also a person who sits with an inner critic all the time saying, "That is a piece of shit, you are kidding me." So I've just got to get there straight as soon as I can before it starts, and then write something down. So I think that I'm any writer who's a professional writer. You all know that you're incredibly disciplined, and so but mornings are my best time. I don't really function so much in the evenings, and that was when I was at school or university. I couldn't really study at night. So I think the closer I am to that unconscious life, that dream life, the happier I am, really. And then once you've got something on the page, and it might just be a big mess, then you can work with it. But the closer the quicker you can get something down, I think the better.
Lovely. Okay, so we've been introduced to the characters of Pamela and Chris, and now we'll have Susan read.
This is the first email that gets sent awry. So it's from Pamela in Sydney. She's a librarian at Ashfield Library, and she's sending it to her husband, Christophe, in Paris. It's headlined Raphael. From Pamela Robinson, and I have the email address, to Chris Woods, Chris's email address. And she's got two email addresses because she's not sure exactly which one's going to go to who. Dear Chris, alors, Rafe turned 16 today. Can you ever forget the sight of him new, no bigger than your fist? A machine keeping his lungs open between breaths, his own body not knowing how to breathe, believing it still lived underwater. Remember when he was released from his radiant cradle, I donned a lead apron like a bulletproof vest and placed him against an X-ray machine, holding up his tiny arms, tender as the new shoots of a plant. Why was I wearing the protective vest and not him? His smudge of self barely there. His lungs were fine, and now he's 16 years old, filling those same brave lungs with carcinogenic smoke. Do you know he smokes? I've forbidden it, of course, but I know he does. The first generation to grow up bombarded with anti-tobacco propaganda, and he takes up smoking. Time is a trickster. I feel at any moment I might turn around and find Rafe swaddled on the couch behind me. My first baby, my terror, my love, unfingered by life. Yesterday, I came across a photo of him and Claude in the garden at Dorville before Baptiste was born, both of them small enough to squeeze into nappy buckets, smiling up at the camera. I felt as if I could walk into the frame to find everyone living in that moment, dumb to the future. I've wanted to write to you many times, most often to say that if I'd known the cost of leaving the marriage, I would never have left. I'm to blame for the pain the boys have endured, and if this is something you wanted to hear, then yes, I admit it. But what I regret most is telling you that I didn't love you anymore. Bad advice I heeded, and my fault for asking for advice and following it. You will always be the father of my children, and I will always love you. For what it's worth, I'm very sorry for what happened to us, but sorrier for Raphael, Claude, and Baptiste. We created 3 sons, a truth that will exist forever in time. Love, Pamela. Mistake from Chris Woods to Pamela Robinson. Hi, Pamela. You have the wrong person. Email address. Good luck, and I hope things work out for you. Take care. Chrysanthi Woods.
I think we've got some time for questions, if there's any questions.
I've got a comment that I want to read from a Zoom audience member. This is a comment from Diane. And Diane says, I received an email meant for another person with my name. I discovered she was a relative, and we are still in contact after 10 years. So thanks, Diane, for that. That was a really, these things happen.
Yeah.
They really do.
Absolutely.
So are there any other questions from the audience? So there's one back there. And what I might do is get Fiona to repeat the question.
So what about the Mum and Me in Greece memoir? What's
Oh,
happening
yes.
with that?
So Edwin is asking what's happening with the memoir of you and your mother in Kithera.
Okay, so I got a 2-book contract with Alan Numan, and I'd already written one version or several versions of the novel. So it was really the living part. So for everybody who doesn't know, I went to Kithera, which is an island south of the Peloponnesus, just north of Crete. So it's between Crete and the Peloponnese. And it is home to many, many Greek Australians from Brisbane. And in fact, my link with them goes back to going to school with Greek Australians. And I went to Kithera the first time when I was 19 with Chrysanthi, and Stella wasn't there. And I fell in love with Greece immediately. It was a very cold winter. It was the winter of 1976, I think. It was one of the the coldest winters in for some time. And you know, I froze my butt off in England. I froze my butt off in Paris. We were going through, and then I remember coming out into the Greek light. I'm thinking, my God, this is the same planet. This is like it was actually Greek Easter. And if anybody's been to Greece in Greek Easter, it is a very joyous and wonderful time. And so I went back, in fact, lived there for a while when I was 20, and I lived there for almost 9 months. And I'd always wanted to go back, but I didn't go back until one of my novels was translated into Greek in 2013. And I've had European translations before, but that made me the happiest I've been to have a Greek translation. It was really wonderful. Okeanos is the publisher in Greece. And so when I went back, I thought that was about 2017 or something like that. And then I just wanted to go back again. So I hatched this plan. I used to be a journalist at the Courier Mail. But as soon as my kids left, both my boys now live in London, I started to think, you know, maybe there's a way of going back. So to my astonishment, I asked my mother, who was 85 at the time, do you want to come to live on Kithera with me, Mum? And she said, yeah, why not? So it was, you know, it took a lot of organising, I can tell you. Like the most part, like medical insurance was the worst part of it. It was about $7,500 US for 1 year. So we had to split that in my family to sort of make sure that if anything happened to her. So we went in, as you know, in March 2019. So it's almost been 2 years. But luckily, Mum came back before COVID hit. So we're talking about November 2019, which was a miracle. Who knew that this was going to happen? I mean, no one has known that this was, no one could have foreseen what happened with COVID. In fact, if it had happened last year, we wouldn't have gone. If, you know, maybe we would have gone because no one even knew how bad it was going to get. I got stuck in London for 4.5 months because I went to do some research at the at the National Archives in Kew to do some original document research, and I wouldn't have gone, obviously, if I'd known what was going to happen. So I got stuck in London in lockdown for 4.5 months.
Do we have another question for Susan?
Oh, I don't think I answered the question. I think the answer to the question was, sorry, I'm writing it after all this is over, after the book stuff is over. I am actually going to write it, and I've got about 10,000 words, and I've worked out a structure and everything, but it's tentatively called Sea and Stone, a daughter, a mother, and a Greek island. But that may change. But, you know, hopefully ANU want to publish it maybe next year or the year after.
Great. Okay, so a final question from me. What happened to the person that you accidentally wrote to?
I am still in touch with him. He has now retired to Mexico and he's writing his novel, finally. So I'm actually really looking forward to sending him a copy of a real book in these imagined hands that I've never seen. I mean, how weird is that?
Great. Oh, so we've got...
How intimate are the females with this?
Well, pretty intimate. But,
So sorry for the question from the audience for Zoomers is how intimate were the emails between you and your person?
Luckily, very early on, I established that he had a wife. And, you know, I of course, I Googled him. I, you know, did the whole thing, you know, is he a serial killer? Is he a, you know, he was who he said he was. He worked at the school where he said he was, because I could find out all that information. So I very early on, I knew he was a legitimate person. And I knew he was happily married and he had girls. And, you know, that was one of the other links was he had girls the same age as my sons, and we were desperately trying to keep them off social, you know, not social media. It wasn't so much social media, but it was games. And in his girls' case, it was their phones. But in my boys' case, it was, you know, playing games and, you know, so we had that sort of link. But now he and his wife have retired to Mexico. So they're actually, yeah.
It's lovely.
And he's writing his novel.
And it's a question, we've got a question here and then there.
We were both reporters on the Courier Mail. Was that a good background for you as a writer? I mean,
So the question was, was being a journalist a good background for writing?
I think so, because it forces you to notice things, and you know that's what you do. You sort of and Chris Olsen is here as well, and Chris also spent time, and Sandra Hogan. There's many ex alumni here from the Courier Mail, so there's you know it is a good background, and you know we've got 3 writers here, so you know that proves just how good it is. I think in a way that it, you know, I think it takes you a while to work out the difference between journalism and fiction, but those things are breaking down now. If you look at a writer like Helen Garner, for example, I think those old genres are breaking down much more.
And was there a question in the middle? Yep.
Oh, it's a bit of an odd one, but you know, through the process of email, you're creating yourself.
Yes.
So in a way, you're falling in love with yourself. The intimacy that is created between both parties is in fact a kind of a fantasy or a manufactured intimacy.
That's a really good question. I think that, sorry, did everyone hear that?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question.
It is when you're writing an email, you're kind of creating a sense of it could be it's a fantasy, and it could be of yourself, and it could in fact be a false self, and that is discussed within the emails between them. But yes, in fact, Pamela talks about writing as a performative act. Exactly. So you don't really know. They could all both be lying.
Yes, but even they're kind of lying to themselves.
Yes.
Is the point.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And they talk about that too. Yep. Good point. Yeah.
Yeah, good. I think that might be. Oh, can I get the CAK?
Oh, yeah, yes.
in true Avid fashion, we have a cake to launch.
A cake? Oh, fantastic. Thank you.
So we can't have candles because of COVID, because you can't just kind of slag all over people's cakes anymore.
Oh,
But we
thank
wish you all the best from everybody here in the audience, from everybody at Avid. We wish you, and from where I fell, a wonderful future.
Thank you so much. Thank
Happy birthday to the book.
Yes.
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear, from where I fell. Happy birthday to you. Hooray! Thank you so much. Oh my God, this is wonderful. It's too beautiful to cut. It is a beautiful cake, and Fiona Stager made it with her own hands, so it's very exciting. It's been an absolute pleasure to listen to you. I really when I hear you read and when I hear you speak, I always think, yes, this is, we're in the hands of a real writer who thinks deeply, and I always get something off every page of a book by Susan Johnson. So I'm really excited that you not only have one new book today, but another book coming out within the next 2 years, which is very exciting. And Fiona, you did a fantastic job, so thank you very much for that. Thanks to Fiona and Susan. And what we're going to do now to make this a little bit easier for the next part of the event tonight is that we're going to put away the chair. So when we would move, if you're on a foldable chair, if you can fold it and lean it against something, and then we'll take it out of the way. The books are for sale at the counter, and we're going to take this little table down towards the front of the shop, and we're going to get Susan to sign copies of the book down from the front. So bear with us.
You get cake when you
when you get your book signed, there'll be cake there. So bear with us as we get the place in order. Thank you.